Okay, let's finish up with chapter 1. Hypothesis, theory, and law. When we look into scientific method, you'll also oftentimes hear these different terms. Hypothesis, theory, and law. Tough one to pronounce. Well, basically, these are three different ways we rank scientific ideas. In the scientific method, we identify a problem, some part of our understanding that is missing, maybe is in error. We have to correct that. We discover something that we didn't expect. Well, a hypothesis is our first attempt at coming up with a solution to that problem. Once we've identified the problem, we've got to say, well, what do we think is happening here? That's a hypothesis. The theory represents an experiment where we attempt to falsify the hypothesis. We test it to see if the hypothesis can survive and if we can validate it. If it passes, then it graduates to a theory. Theories that are tested more and more and more become stronger and stronger until over decades, if not centuries, if they're proven often enough and they're pretty much accepted as truth, they become a scientific law. So scientific law is actually a theory, it's just been tested a lot more. So, hypothesis. Basically an idea arrived at through logic, through previous experience, but it's basically just a first attempt to the solution, finding a solution to a problem. Theory, we take what we believe is an explanation, we test it. Remember, for it to be scientific, for it to be valid, it has to have the ability to be falsifiable, which means the experiment must have the opportunity to test it and perhaps demonstrate that it's false. Well, if it's not false and it passes, that hypothesis is a theory. And again, scientific law, it's just a theory that's been tested so often. Ampere's law, Faraday's law, Gauss's law, Newton's laws of motion, the universal law of gravity. We call them laws because they've been tested time and time again, and they hold up to any type of scrutiny that we can place them under, within limits. So again, scientific method, it's not really a recipe for how we perform experiments. Oftentimes I think we do experiments in school and they're pre-packaged and we fill out these sheets. It's really, the scientific method is a philosophy of how science is done. Okay? We define a problem, we attempt at a solution to that problem, we test this idea, okay? And then from the experiment, we try to figure out what we know and what we don't know. Science is a search for understanding, and we do this understanding by, again, testing our ideas through experiments. Now, science is less of a linear process than a cyclical process. Again, think about what we do. We observe in nature, constantly observing the world around us. We're trying to identify patterns. Suddenly we come across a pattern that we can't explain. That creates something where we can basically come up with an idea. All right? So again, we might form a hypothesis based on that, perform research to test the hypothesis, and then based on our experimental observations, designate it a theory or start all over again. Okay, again, it's very much cyclical. Now, right now, we're going through a period of time where the scientific method is extremely important because, well, one of the reasons why we're virtual is because we are experiencing an outbreak of COVID-19. Right now we're testing a number of different treatments for it. We're testing a number of different vaccines. And we're following very closely the scientific method as it's been designed for any type of clinical trial. Now, what we do is we follow something called a control experiment. The most direct way to test a simple hypothesis is to compare two or more groups where the difference between the two groups essentially test the hypothesis. So for instance, let's say we have two compounds, A and B. We want to test if A is effective at treating some condition. We would test it against another compound, perhaps B, and in doing so, we can compare the two results and see which one was more effective. Now, blind control experiments are important to eliminate bias. While bias can be done consciously, oftentimes bias is introduced in experiments totally by accident. So in these experiments, we do a blind type of experiment where the subjects that we are studying are unaware of what treatment or protocol they receive. And we double blind it by having the observers, the researchers, not know initially which treatment is being received by which patients. By doing this, there's no way of introducing bias simply based on what the patient or researcher's expectations are. The only outcome is determined by, is this particular drug, treatment, whatever, device effective? Now with COVID-19, the SARS-2 COVID virus is, or SARS-CoV-2 virus is really receiving top priority in terms of developing antiviral drugs, developing just general treatments, and also trying to develop a vaccine to build up our immunity. So there's several vaccine studies that are out there right now, and each of them is going through a different level of testing. Now, normally the way that we test these things is we start out with a laboratory test where we try to identify a compound that we think might be helpful, a vaccine we might think is helpful, or even existing drugs where we think they might have an effect. We then design some research protocol where we essentially intend to investigate something, do some testing on animals, do some virtual testings to make sure that it's safe, and then the clinical trials begin. Clinical trial is an experiment on human subjects, and it's really the only way we can see whether or not something is safe and something is effective. In the first trial, we do an assessment of the drug. We normally take 20 to 100 patients, and we give them this particular therapy and try to see which dose is going to be safe in order to give them. Okay? So perhaps if we're developing a vaccine, we want to see how much vaccine we need to give such that we generate antibodies without generating other adverse effects. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is proof of concept. Okay? Do we see beneficial effects? For instance, again, do we generate antibodies? Can we identify any undesirable effects? Are there side effects? Finally, phase 3, which is the double blind, compares this particular therapy, vaccine, to existing therapies. For the COVID right now, you're probably comparing vaccines to simply a placebo. Okay? But again, the whole idea of testing it right here, we have about 1,000 subjects at this level here. I know Moderna is, I think, actually using 30,000, as is Pfizer, for their vaccine. Basically, you're testing to see who gets a higher infection rate, those who receive the placebo or those who receive the vaccine. And if we can demonstrate better results for the test group, then we've shown that, at least in part, this treatment was effective. So that's what's happening right now. Right now, quite a few of these vaccines, as we'll see, are in phase 3 trial. Typically, this clinical research can take 10 years. That's the typical timeline. Obviously, this has been shortened up quite a bit, so hopefully the undesirable effects won't show up in the long run, but we've really accelerated the testing for this. At the end, we look at the data, try to make a determination. The FDA will give approval or will not give approval, But there's always follow-up that happens after it receives approval. What we call a phase 4 is done to make sure that once the drug is out there, and this is going to be especially important for anything that we develop here, that it continues to be safe and no long-term adverse effects happen beyond the clinical research part. So again, when I made this, there were basically 165 different corona vaccines which were underdeveloped. Okay? 19 of them were in phase 1, so basically they're testing safety and dosage. 11 were in phase 2, basically an expanded safety trial, also trying to look at effectiveness. 8 in phase 3, so there are quite a few here. There were 2 approved for limited use, but really big asterisks right here because truly they're still sitting in phase 3. Hopefully with all these different vaccines that are going through the trial, at least one of them is going to be shown to be both safe and effective. So there's an application of the scientific method. Again, define a problem. Here the problem is we need a cure for this potentially deadly disease. Hypothesis. Okay? Well, I think if we take some of the proteins that are on the surface of the virus, or some of the RNA that produces the protein, or however they generate that particular vaccine, that if we inject that into a human, it'll initiate a response. So, a few different hypotheses going through here. 19 hypotheses in phase 1, 11 hypotheses in phase 2, about 10 in phase 3. Each of them are undergoing a test. Hopefully, we will have success with one of these. Experiments being run, okay? The theory, of course, will be that if one of these vaccines shows safety and effectiveness, the theory is that this would be a good treatment to prevent, or at least reduce the spread of the virus. Here's the down part. If we look at some examples of the last 50 years, here are some emerging diseases which have been, which they've tried to create a vaccine for. Zika was in the news recently, and it was first identified a long time ago. The first vaccine was attempted in 1947, but really, very recently, there's quite a bit of an outbreak, especially in South America with this. So the ongoing trials have sort of been accelerated for this. Chickenpox, we developed a vaccine for that. The first attempt was 1953, but by 1995, we had pretty much eradicated chickenpox, varicella virus, sorry, I was saying smallpox. And now this vaccine is fairly common to prevent chickenpox and shingles. Hepatitis B, we have a vaccine for. Ebola, this is sort of a kind of a success and not so successful. We do have a vaccine for Ebola, however, it is minimally effective. It does reduce the fatality rate. However, people still get very sick from it. We still have an ongoing development for a vaccine against HIV. SARS was actually canceled because the vaccines that they developed from SARS actually triggered autoimmune diseases, so that was a problem. And MERS, which is actually a coronavirus, that vaccine trial was started in 2012 and it's still ongoing. So you can see here, between where the disease is first identified and the vaccine gets approval, it can be quite a long time. So if we do have a coronavirus vaccine in 1 year, that's unprecedented. In the scientific field, we use something called peer review. Peer review is basically where when you do research, other people in your field will evaluate that research and make a determination as to the validity of your research, and also examine if you've made any errors. Obviously, with clinical drug trials, peer review is being done by other scientists within the FDA before they actually do approval. In most cases, if you publish in a scientific journal, what will happen is, we'll go to this process right here, you'll send your discovery to an editor. The editor is just there to see if you have the proper formatting and make sure that you've sent it to the right journal. They will then send it to a bunch of referees who are anonymous. They work in your field, and they will basically look over what you've done. They want to make sure that what you've done hasn't been done before in some other experiment. You're not giving credit to people before you. They'll make sure that the methods that you use were proper. And they'll make sure that the conclusions that you reach had a logical basis to them. If there's anything of concern, they'll contact the editor will contact you. Changes will be made, sent back to the editor. If it satisfies the referees, then it can go off and be published. Again, this is a very important aspect of science because it reduces the amount of fraud, it reduces the amount of repetition, and it's even used when we are doing grant applications. It's very expensive to do science anymore. It's not an endeavor that's typically undertaken by a single person. Oftentimes you have huge groups of researchers working on the same project. This means that the money which is used has to be used in a very, very efficient way. So again, when you need to do research, you send out a grant application, and this is peer reviewed, and again, analyzed much like if you were sending your research to a scientific journal. Okay, finally, what is physics? Physics, of course, is the most fundamental of sciences. That doesn't mean it's the best. Fundamental means that it is the most general. We're taking things and looking at them at the most simple, fundamental level that we can. Now, you think of biology, the study of life; geology, the study of the earth; astronomy, the study of the heavens; geology, the study of the earth. They are the study of some part of the world around us. Physics is a study of the physical world, so it really encompasses a lot of different things. What makes it so different is it simplifies things to very, very simple systems. So we're analyzing systems on the lowest level that we can and coming up with general rules for this. Oftentimes, what is discovered in physics can oftentimes be applied to other disciplines, such as in chemistry, we have quantum mechanics, which is very important to the way that chemicals bond. In biology, we have energy transport. So, conservation of energy is very, very important to processes like photosynthesis and metabolism. Okay? Geology, well, all the geological processes involve some type of physical mechanism. So, physics will oftentimes work with other disciplines to understand a particular phenomenon. Because physics is very general, okay, we try to simplify things into basically mathematical relationships, equations, if you will. We will use equations to attempt to predict the way a system will behave, and therefore, one of the big knocks on physics is oftentimes the amount of math that you have to learn. But again, we try to keep the systems as simple as possible. And we use less math in this course than we would in a conventional physics course. But math is just one of those things you can't avoid in physics. Branches of physics, we will mostly cover a lot of the more classical physics. We'll talk about some more modern physics too. But classical mechanics talks about motion before the 20th century. electricity and magnetism, the electric force, the magnetic force, thermodynamics, the study of heat, acoustics, quantum mechanics, nuclear physics, relativity, all different branches of physics. Now I like this diagram right here because it really shows how science is interconnected with the different branches. We have classical physics, which is really where we start this course off, and then we have other, classical mechanics, other parts of classical physics, such as classical electrodynamics, classical mechanics. Over here we get to the more modern forms. Relativity talks about objects that are traveling very close to the speed of light or in very large gravitational fields. Quantum mechanics talks about the very small. And then, of course, there's some more exotic branches of physics, such as studying quantum gravity, which merges relativity and quantum mechanics, trying to understand things like dark energy and dark matter. A lot of these things we don't know even where to start. But going from left to right, here is basically where all the established laws sit. As we move further and further, we look many of the discoveries that were made in the 20th century, and off to the right, we're looking at a lot of what the future holds. Classical mechanics is where we start. Most of this is the work by Sir Isaac Newton, so you're going to hear a lot about Newton's laws of motion. You'll hear about the universal law of gravitation. As we said, thermodynamics, the study of thermal properties. I even taught a course called Physics of Sports, where we looked at the mechanics involved in different sporting events. Again, electricity and magnetism, how the electric field and the gravitational field, the electric field and the magnetic field interact with matter and with each other. And again, quantum mechanics, talking about how they're very small, how things move on a very small scale, such as the atom, such as the nucleus, and relativity, things moving very quickly or under an intense gravitational field. Okay, so that's what we have to look ahead. And again, the important aspect of this chapter is really to focus on the units. Understand what are the SI units, what are the metric prefixes, how do we create compound units from our base units.